Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. Tonight, we start the second book of Shmuel. Last week, we finished Shmuel Aleph, and tonight we start Shmuel Bet. Shmuel Aleph ended with the death of King Saul, his sons, especially Yehonatan, who was very close to David, and the Philistines took his body and hung it from the walls of one second. Beit Shan, yes, and Mount Gilboa. And the people of Benjamin risked their lives, and they redeemed the body of Shaul. They were able to recapture it, and take it for proper burial.
Beit Shan was hit yesterday.
Okay. Okay, continuing. So this is where the second book of Shmuel opens up, and that is that David wasn't at this battle. If you remember, it's a long story. People can get the recording from last week, but David, who had been hiding out with the Philistines, when the Philistines attacked King Shaul, David was not there. And so at this point, he doesn't know what happened. And so he is in Ziklag. That's where David and his family and his 600 men were holed up or stationed. And someone came, all disheveled, with his clothes ripped and mud on his head. And he came and he asked to talk to David. And he was the one who told David that Shaul had been killed and that his sons and Yonatan had been killed. And when David heard this, so he said, "How do you know?" He said, "Well, I was there. And what happened was, I just happened to be near Shaul HaMelech, and he had been very injured. And he turned to me and he said, he was like in the process of dying. At least this person thought so. And he said, Shaul HaMelech said to him, please take your sword and finish me off, because I'm at the end and I don't want the Philistines to capture me alive. So this man said, I saw that he was not going to live, and so I did what he asked and I killed him. Now we should take notice that in the end of Shmuel Aleph, it describes the death of Shaul, and it does not mention this person at all. So there is a question who this person was, and was he telling the truth? We know that Shaul died, that we know. And we know that, according to the first account, Shaul himself fell on his sword. He was in the throes of death, and he felt it would have been a desecration of God's name that the king would be captured by the Philistines. And so he fell on his sword. But here, this person has a whole different story. So the story continues that David, when he heard this, he rent his clothes, what's called kriya. And this is one of the sources that when we hear of someone dying, usually it's the 7 close relatives: father, mother, brother, sister, spouse, or son, daughter. Here, Shaul was his father-in-law, but there's also a custom that when a great person dies, then it's permissible to rent your clothes. So it says that David and everyone with him, they rent their clothes, they fasted, they mourned, they wept for the whole day. And this again is proof of what we've been saying all along, that David never meant Shaul harm, even though he was anointed in secret by Shmuel. God made it clear that he has taken away the throne and the kingship from Shaul HaMelech. Nonetheless, we saw consistently David avoided hurting Shaul, even though he had the chance many times to kill him. And in fact, his soldiers almost begged him to kill Shaul while he had the chance, and he would not do it. Each time he would talk to Shaul and say, I could have just killed you. I'm trying to show you I mean you no harm. And David was dedicated to Shaul. And even though it was clear that he would be the next king, he would not do anything to make that happen. In other words, he basically, God, if you want to make me king, you're going to have to arrange it, because I'm not going to lift a finger against what he called Mashiach Hashem, the anointed of God. So after they rent their clothes, they mourn, they fast. So David talked to this person again, and the person brought the crown of the king and his bracelet to show David that what I'm telling is the truth. Now, no one was there to see if he was actually the one who killed him, but he did have the crown and the bracelet, and he admitted to killing Shaul. And so David had him killed. He said, how did you have the nerve to take the life of the anointed of God? And it turns out that this person was from Amalek. And what somehow he must have been in the camp of the Philistines. And then when he saw Shaul, he decided he would take the crown. It's really not clear what he was doing there, but he admitted that he was from Amalek. So afterwards, starting in the 17th verse of the first chapter of Shmuel Bet, David laments the death of Shaul and his sons, and especially Yonatan. And here that the language is, V'konen David et hakina hazot al Shaul v'al Yonatan beno, that he lamented with this lamentation for Shaul and his son Yonatan. Now, what is significant about this is on Tisha B'Av, we read a whole series of what are called kinot, from the same word here of lamentations. On Tisha B'Av, we spend almost a whole morning reading these very, very sad, very descriptive of the terrible slaughter that happened in the destruction of the temples. And over the years, they were keynote were added. And even in most books for Tisha B'Av, there's now a number of keynote for the Holocaust. There's a keynote for the Crusades. And so over literally thousands of years. But what's significant here is, in a certain way, when you read through this lamentation, the tone of it, the language of it, really led the way for all subsequent keynote. And especially this is approximately 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. What's considered in a certain way the most ancient of the keynote that we say on Tisha B'Av was written by Jeremiah, for the king Yoshiyahu. And I believe last week we actually discussed the whole story of King Yoshiyahu. It's an amazing story. People are invited to see the recording from last week. And it was like close to 500 years later. So this lamentation by David, we're not going to go through it word by word, but for those who want to, it begins on the 17th verse, and it goes all the way to chapter 2. And again, the language is really, in a certain way, set the tone for future keynote. Just like David's Psalms paved the way for Hebrew poetry throughout the generations. But part of it is the following, where it says, and I'll read it in English. O Yehonatan, slain in thy high places, I am distressed for thee, my brother Yehonatan. Very dear hast thou been to me. Thy love to me was wonderful, more than the love of women. How are the mighty fallen? So here, I'm going to digress a little bit. And I realize that in modern culture, this is a very sensitive subject. But I want to be clear, because this description by David, that his love between him and Yonatan was more precious than the love of women. So very unfortunately, in modern times, people have taken modern culture, modern ways that people behave, and have reinterpreted this as if David and Yonatan had a homosexual relationship. This flies in the face of all Jewish tradition. And the fact that David would say such a thing in such an innocent and a pure way, knowing that in Jewish law, homosexual relationships are not approved of. That's why I don't want to get into the state of the world right now. But here, the fact that David, knowing that, had no shame or no inhibition to express how deep the love between he and Yonatan was. In Pirkei Avot, their love is used as the example of a type of love that is not dependent on anything. And if we look at relationships, love relationships between men and women, no matter how deep the love is, there, in a certain way, it is dependent on certain things, especially in a marriage relationship in Judaism. intimate relations are very positive. It's a very, very important part of Jewish marriage relationships. And so in a certain way, it is dependent on certain things. In marriage, men depend on their wives for certain things. Wives depend on their husbands for certain things. So even though it could be a very pure love, it's dependent on something. But here, the example of a love that was not dependent on anything, and that in a way nullifies that even the thought that there was any sexual connection in this relationship. And it went to such a degree that Yonatan, he was supposed to be the next king. He was in line to be the next king. And that's why his father was so upset at him, that Yonatan understood that David is meant to be king, not me. And so in a certain way, he sacrificed everything. But in the end, I want to say Yehonatan died with his father. In other words, his love of David, even though his father was furious at him, it never nullified his love and respect and loyalty and honor that he gave to his father. And so he literally died with him in showing his loyalty. So I just wanted to mention that, because here we see just such an innocent, pure statement of love between two people. And I'll mention that in one of the books that Rav Ginsburg wrote, it's in Hebrew. The English version has never come out. Years ago, I actually helped prepare it. It just hasn't come to light yet. But it's based on the idea that there are 13 different types of love relationships between God and Israel, between Israel and God, between teachers and students, between students and teachers, between husbands and wives, wives and husbands, brothers and sisters, sisters and brothers, friends, between the king and the people and the people and the king. It comes to 13 different relationships. Sometimes when we hear about love relationships, we think almost exclusively of men and women relationships. But there are many, many types of love relationships, and many of them are like David and Yehonatan. They're absolutely pure relationships, not dependent on anything. So that was just an important statement. Now we go to chapter 2. And after this, we see in a series of times, we have to remember that the son of the priest of Nov, that Shaul killed the whole city, was Eviatar. And he came with the Urim and Tumim, the way, we'll call it the oracle that the high priest would wear, and only questions of great import could be asked of the Urim and the Tumim. So David, after this whole thing, is like, in a certain way, he's set up now to be king. And so he asked Urim and Tumim, should I go up to Yehuda? And he was told, yes, go to Yehuda. And he goes at that point with his two wives. And it says there, the tribe of Yehuda anointed David as king over their tribe. Now, this needs some comment, because at this point, he's not king of all of Israel, as we're going to see in 1 minute. But the tribe of Yehuda anointed him as king. He becomes king of Yehuda. And we have to realize that at that point of Jewish history, the tribes were very, very independent and very clannish. And they had their portion in the land. They had their customs. They had their extended families. And it was very much like an extended family, each of the tribes. It was David, as we're going to be learning in Shmuel Bet, he was the one who really brought all of the tribes together in a way that the national identity became, in a certain way, even more important than the tribal identity. And so right after this, the story continues. And first of all, David sends a message to the people of Yavesh Gilad. These are the people who risked their lives to get the body of Shaul and give it a proper burial in the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, Shaul was from Benjamin. And he sends them like a blessing. Like, what you did was such a right thing. And I applaud you for it. In a certain way, remember the first king was from Benjamin. So in a certain way, David was kind of sending like a peace offering. And then he mentions, by the way, the tribe of Yehuda have anointed me king over them. In a certain way, hinting that he is now, he had many chances to kill Shaul, and he wouldn't, but now his time has come. In a certain way, that was the message he sent. But then the story continues, and we find out that Shaul and 3 of his sons were killed in battle, but he had another son, and his name was Ish-Boshet, you could call it a man of great humbleness. And he was, as we're going to see, he wasn't a very strong figure. But who sets him up was the general of Shaul, who either survived the battle with the Philistines or for some reason wasn't there, but he's still alive. So Avner takes the son of Shaul and he anoints him as king over the rest of Israel. So now here we have, we'll call it a problem. David is now king of Yehuda, and Avner, who is a very, very strong personality, he sets up Ish-Boshet to be the king of Israel. And here, for the first time, it mentions that David was king in Hebron. Hebron is in Yehuda for 7.5 years. Ish-Boshet, it just mentions it here. Ish-Boshet, in the end, only ruled for 2 years. And what happened is the following, is that we have a conflict here. It's as if we have 2 kings. Now, this is before there was a division between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, but here already we see the roots of it. There are now 2 kings in Israel. And so the general of Ish-Boshet, he and his men meet Yoav. Yoav is David's general. And they happen to have met in a place by like a pool. And it was in the pool of Givon. And things got out of hand, and they ended up battling each other, and it turned into a major battle. And the forces of Yoav were victorious. So Avner is kind of like running away with his men. And it says that Yoav, so he had two brothers, Avishav and Asael. Remember, Yoav is the general who has now defeated Avner, at least in this skirmish, this battle. The Asael, his brother, so the text describes him as being as swift as a deer. And he chased after Avner, and he kind of cornered him. And Avner says, let's just end this right now. Just go away, leave me alone. Let's just call this a day. And Asael would not listen. Asael probably was going to kill him. And so Avner did try to get Asael to back off, and Asael would not. And so Avner kills Asael. And then Yoav is now chasing Avner, and he realizes Avner just killed his brother. And Avner at a certain point says, let's stop this now before we everyone gets killed. And Yoav listened to him, and Yoav backed off, and they went their ways. But here we see the seeds of later will become the split of the kingdoms here. And the third chapter begins by saying there was a long period of warfare between the house of Shaul and the house of David. But David became stronger and stronger day by day, and the house of Shaul became weaker and weaker, because Ishbosheth Avner set him up in a certain way as a figurehead. He didn't really have kingly attributes. But since he was the king of Shaul, he's set up as king. So what happens next is apparently Shaul had a concubine. Remember, in those days, there was call it a full marriage and a 3/4 kind of marriage. We don't have that today, and it may sound a little bit foreign to us, but that's how it was done in those days. And so the king, Shaul, had a concubine. He's now dead. And Avner wants to be with his concubine. In fact, he is. And Ishbosheth, this is in a certain way a credit to Ishbosheth. In a certain way, he knows that he's dependent on Avner for his power. And yet he's really outraged that Avner would take the concubine, we'll call it even the wife of Shaul. He just felt that was wrong. And he confronted Avner. And as I said, Avner was a very, very strong personality. And he became very insulted, extremely insulted. And he even tells Ishbosheth, I'm the power behind the throne. I'm gonna put my power behind David. And so what happens is Avner sends a message to David and says, and it's very important that he says that he accepts that David really is meant to be the next king. In other words, even though David was anointed in private, the word has gotten out. And we have to remember that one of the reasons that Shaul became so jealous of David, that David was the greatest warrior in Israel, not just when he killed Goliath, in many, many different battles. And this we learned already, that he was he became more famous than Shaul, and Shaul became very jealous and then realized that this was a setup for David to become king. Even though we saw and discussed it right here many times that David refused to take that step. And here, a very interesting thing happens is that David sends back to Avner and says, you can come and meet with me, but I want you to send back my first wife, Michal. Now, if you remember, Shaul had taken Michal and married her to another man. Whole question, like, how did that happen? Because she was still married to David. And we already learned that this new husband understood that there's something like not kosher here. And he never was with her intimately. And so they never really consummated the marriage. And so it wasn't a full marriage in that sense. And so Avner sends away this husband. And the story doesn't really tell what happens afterwards, and brings Michal back to David, but she, at least in the next few chapters, she's not even mentioned. So we'll have to see how that develops. So Avner then goes to the elders of the tribes, and he says, it's clear to me that Hashem has chosen David to be king over all of Israel. In other words, he abandoned Ishbosheth. Whether he used this excuse that he was insulted, that Ishbosheth challenged his right to take the wife of Shaul, or it's something that would have happened anyways. But here, at least, the trigger was this whole incident. So Avner goes to see David, and David welcomes him and trusts him, and he takes him at his word. And Avner comes to David and says, I will deliver all of Israel into your hands. In other words, you're meant to be king. I'll make a covenant with you, and that is what's going to happen. And David agrees. He gives him great honor. And even though Avner, in a certain way, was a rival of his, but here he buries the hatchet and accepts Avner at his word. But what happens then is Avner is now going back, and he's going to make arrangements. He's going to talk to all the tribes. Everyone's going to come together and anoint David as king of all of Israel. So when Avner leaves, Yoav follows him. Now remember, Yoav is the general of David, and Avner has killed his brother. And so he goes after him, and he says, can we talk? And so Avner, because David, it was clear that David accepted him, and they made an arrangement. It even uses the word covenant. And Yoav kills Avner on the spot. Avner just wasn't prepared, and Yoav kills him for killing his brother. When David hears this, he was outraged, and he again, almost like Shaul, he rends his clothes, he mourns, and he actually, it's interesting, he curses Yoav, because Yoav acted on his own, and David had no part of this. And so then the text describes that David went out of his way to try to show all of Israel that he had nothing to do with this. He had nothing to do with this. And apparently, people accepted this. People accepted this. And like I said, David goes out of his way to mourn publicly Avner and makes the point, and it is accepted. So then what happens is that Avner is now dead. Ishbosheth is still technically king. So Avner's whole plan of delivering all of Israel into David's domain didn't happen. So now the text in the 4th chapter describes that there actually was a son of Yehonatan, and that he was lame when this child was 5 years old. When the news came that Shaul and his father Yonatan had been killed, the nurse tried to flee because she didn't know if the Philistines were coming. She didn't know what would be, and she dropped him, and he was injured, and he was called Mipi Boshet, just like his it would be his uncle. I'm thinking out loud. No. It was Shaul's son, and this is Yonatan's son. So you'll pardon me, but I can't remember what that relationship would be. Anyways, you'll forgive me. And so what happens now is that Ishbosheth had 2 other generals named Baana and Rechav. And they saw what was happening here. They saw that Avner really had given up on Ishbosheth. Everyone started to see that David was meant to be king. And so what they did, they went and they killed Ishbosheth, and they cut off his head, and they brought it to David in Hebron. They thought David would be like, oh, great job. Again, David had nothing to do with this. They thought, okay, like it's obviously David's going to be king. Someone's got to get rid of Ishbosheth. They thought they had done something really good. David, again, was outraged. And he had both of them killed because they had killed Ishbosheth. And again, he mourns Ishbosheth. He makes a point to all of Israel that he had nothing to do with this. But the momentum was now in David's favor. So at the beginning of chapter 5, so the elders of Israel, we imagine representatives of all the different tribes, they come to David in Hebron, and they anoint him king over all of Israel. So this is a watershed in Jewish history. David now is king over all of Israel. And so here it mentions, again, it's looking into the future, but it says that David was 30 years old when he began to reign in Hebron. Now remember, it says already that he reigned for 7.5 years in Hebron. And the text continues, and he ruled in Jerusalem for 33 years. So altogether, he reigned for 40 years, and actually 40.5 years. But because it was a year, the text just says 40 years. So he reigned in Hebron for 7.5 years. Even when he became king of all of Israel, he still kept his headquarters, we'll call it, in Hebron. And then in the continuation of chapter 5, here David goes up to Jerusalem. And here it actually says he goes up to Sion and the city of David. And to this day, there is what's called Har Sion and Ir David. Ir David was the original Jerusalem, and it was below where the Temple Mount is. And so here it describes how David now is, in a certain way, moving his headquarters to Jerusalem. Jerusalem had not been conquered to that point. And so David is the one who actually conquers Jerusalem, and he sets up his kingship in the city of David on Sion. This is really it's like the most important mentioning of Sion, of Zion. Zionism is he set up his stronghold in Sion and Ir David. And it actually doesn't even mention the name Jerusalem here. And then Hiram, the king of Tsur in Lebanon, he sees David's greatness, and he starts sending David cedar trees and carpenters and masons in order to make peace between them. And later, we're going to get to it, when Shlomo HaMelech builds the temple, it's Hiram who helps him with the same thing, with carpenters and especially the cedars of Lebanon. And chapter 5 ends with one second. Actually, I want to just go back for a minute, back to when David was in Hebron, going back to the 3rd chapter, where it talks about the sons born to David when he was in Hebron. And at this point, he has 2 wives, and now it mentions a 3rd wife. Up to now, it didn't mention when he married this 3rd wife, but a 3rd wife is mentioned. And so his firstborn, now these names are going to come back to us in the continuation of the story. That's why I wanted to mention it here. Here's where they're first mentioned, that his firstborn was Amnon, and he was born to Achinoam. And the second was Kilav, to Avigail. And then the 3rd was Avshalom. Avshalom is going to play a major part in the continuation of this story. And he was the son of Ma'akah. This is the 3rd wife that hasn't been mentioned when he actually married her. And then the 4th was Adoniah. Sometimes he's called Adoniyahu. he also is going to play a major part, and his mother was Chagit. So we know by tradition that David in his lifetime had 18 different wives. And up to now, we were only introduced to two of them, Achinoam and especially Avigail. There was a whole story. Abigail was married to Naval, and that whole story, which we're not going to go back into here. And so here, and then a couple more sons are mentioned. But here, Amnon is going to play a major part. Adoniyahu is going to play a major part, and Avshalom. So we're going to finish with the 5th chapter, where it actually says that David takes more wives, and then the Philistines, heard that David has been anointed. Now remember, David was the one who killed Goliath of the Philistines. And they come to what's called Emek Rephaim. Now it's interesting that in Jerusalem today, one of the major streets is called Emek Rephaim. It doesn't mean that that's exactly where this place was, but it's named after this place, Emek Rephaim. And there, the Philistines gathered to fight Israel again. And this time, David again asked the Urim and Thummim, should I go to war? And the Urim and Thummim say yes, but they also tell him that he shouldn't meet them head on. He should do like a diversion, and he should only attack from behind. And so here it's mentioned that David does just that, and he was able to defeat the Philistines again. And that's how chapter 5 ends. So we will pick up on chapter 6 next week. Welcome everyone to Insights into the Weekly Haftarah. This week's Torah portion is Korach, who leads a rebellion against Moshe and Aharon. Korach is actually a relative of Moshe, and he leads a serious rebellion against Moshe and Aaron. And Moshe, who has already been described as the most humble person on the face of the earth, he stands up and defends his being the leader, which is in a certain way very almost uncharacteristic of Moshe. Many times when he's challenged, he falls on his face and he begs the people to relent. But here he stands up to Korach, and he actually asks God to back him up here. And he asks God to create a new creation in order to prove to the people that he really was appointed by God himself. And that is what happens, that Moshe tries to get Korach and his followers to step down. They would not. And so Moshe sets up this test, and that God will choose who the leaders are. But at a certain point, Moshe says to the people, he says, if God does not create a new creation and the earth doesn't open up and swallow Korach and his followers, then that's proof that God hasn't sent me. The next verse, the earth opens up, Korach is swallowed up by the earth. So the question is, what haftarah is going to be chosen here? So here it's chosen from actually the first book of Shmuel. For those who have been following our series on Shmuel Aleph, and now we're in Shmuel Bet, we know that originally the people came and asked Shmuel to appoint a king like all the other nations. And Shmuel was very unhappy about this. Not so much that they asked for a king, because in the book of Shoftim, in the Parsha of Shoftim, in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, there is instructions for appointing a king. But the fact that they wanted a king like all the other nations, and they were in a certain way tired of Shmuel being the leader, Shmuel was not very happy about this, and God wasn't very happy. But eventually, God says to Shmuel, listen to the people and anoint a king. So this is where we pick up in the Haftarah. And we could ask a question, because we'll discuss the Haftarah, but you don't see the people rebelling here. And there are other stories in the Tanakh of rebellions that might have been chosen. But here, it's very subtle. That's what we're going to deal with here. So just in general, it says that this is after the people asked, and God said, listen to the people. And he told Shmuel that someone's going to come to you, and he's the one who will be the first king. And it happens just like that. Shaul shows up, and Shmuel, in a certain way, had to convince him to be king, because Shaul was like me, but he convinces him that God had chosen him as king. And here the Haftarah begins where Shmuel says to all the people, come up to Gilgal, and we will renew the kingdom there. And it says all of the people came, and there they made Shaul king. And they had a whole feast. And it says all the people and Shaul were exceedingly joyous. But then Shmuel launches into a long speech to the people. And I'll go through it quickly. And he says to them, I have listened to your voice. You wanted a king? You have a king now. But he says to them, I want to make sure that I'm not the leader now, that everyone will admit I didn't take anything from you. I didn't take money from you. I didn't take a donkey from you. I didn't take an ox from you. I served you loyally without anything in return. And the people acknowledged that and said, yes, it's true. You served everyone without getting anything in return. And according to tradition, a voice comes out of heaven and is the witness that God himself witnesses that Shmuel served with no money given to him for his services. And then Shmuel talks a lot about, he reviews all of Jewish history with them, going back to Egypt and all of the judges and how the people turned away from God. And then Shmuel says, you've now chosen a king, but you have to know that God is the real king. Don't turn away from God just because you have a king. You have to be loyal to the King of Kings. And then he says that I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you that God has been behind me the whole time. It's harvest time now. In Israel, the wheat harvest, the rains have ended. In fact, it's considered not a positive thing for rain to fall near the harvest of wheat. The whole crop could get ruined. But traditionally, the rains have stopped well before the harvest. Shmuel says, I'm going to show you. God is going to bring lightning and thunder and rain just so you keep the fear of God and you don't think because we have a king. And that's what happened. It started thundering and lightning and rain, and the people come and say, they're very fearful. And they say, please stop it. We hear what you're saying. We'll be loyal to God. And Shmuel says, don't be afraid, but remember what I'm saying. Do not turn away from God. And even with all of the sins that you have done over all the generations, God will not turn away from you. And that's the end of the Haftarah. So the subtle thing that is happening here is in the portion of Korach. So one of the explanations is, why did Korach challenge Moshe? So the simple answer is he came with a very populist agenda. Like, why, Moshe, do you raise yourself and Aaron over all the people? All the people are holy, and God is among all the people. It was a very populist kind of message, and it was based on a truth. God is among the people, and all the people in potential are holy. But we're told that really what Korach was doing is he wanted to be the leader. And so it was a whole political kind of backhand way of him becoming the leader. But one of the traditions is that Korach had prophetic vision, and he saw in the future a great soul was going to come from him. And so he figured that this great soul that's going to come from me means that my rebellion is going to succeed. Who is this great soul? Shmuel. And according to tradition, Shmuel, who is a Levi, comes from Korach, who is a Levi. And that's who Korach sees. And he sees that what a great person he is. So he feels that he'll be assured of victory. Now, in the 99th Psalm that we say at Kabbalat Shabbat every week, every Friday night, it's one of the Psalms that we say before Lecha Dodi. And here we say, usually we sing it, but it's Moshe ve'Aaron ve'Kohanan u'Shmuel ve'Korei Shemo Korim el Hashem ve'hu ya'anem. So here it says in the Psalm, Moshe and Aaron are his priests, are his Kohanim, even though Moshe was not a priest. Aaron is a priest, but they're from the tribe of Levi. And Shmuel, B'korei Shemo. And so here they equate Moshe and Aaron to Shmuel. So here we see Shmuel is considered on the level of Moshe and Aaron. Again, Moshe, Aaron, B'kohanav, U'Shmuel, B'korei Shemo. These are the ones who called out to God. And they called out to God, and he answered them. And so just like here, Moshe asked God, make a new creation to prove to the people that you sent me. And in this Haftarah, so Shmuel says, in a certain way, they both put God on the spot. We don't see that Shmuel asked God beforehand. They make this plan together. Here, Shmuel says, God is going to do this like right now. And God does it. So there's a comparison, but there's even more comparisons. That this idea where Shmuel says to the people, I want you to testify, I didn't take anything from you. Nothing. Not even a mule. But if you look in Parshat Korach, Moshe goes to God and says the same thing, but he's saying it to God. Shmuel is saying it to the people. And in other words, Moshe seems to feel that he has to defend himself to God. And he says to God, I've served you loyal. I didn't take anything from the people. And here we see that Shmuel does the same thing, but here he talks to the people. So there are many, many comparisons. I've already mentioned like 3 between this Haftarah and the Parsha of Korach. But here also we see the way that Shmuel is reviewing Jewish history is very similar to the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, where this is Moshe's last will and testament. The whole book of Deuteronomy takes place over 37 days. And a lot of it, in the beginning, Moshe is reviewing with the new generation that's going to go into Israel. Well, what has happened these last 40 years and what happened before in Egypt? Many of them were born afterwards. And so Moshe reviews Jewish history, and that's exactly what Shmuel is doing here also. Moshe is doing it before he takes leave of the people. And Shmuel is also, he doesn't die here. And he remains the prophet, so much so that Shaul is very, very dependent on Shmuel because he recognizes what a great soul he is. But here, in a certain way, Shmuel is taking leave of being the recognized leader. Now there's a king. Nonetheless, in a certain way, Shmuel continued his leadership of Israel, but it was shared with the king. So we see many, many comparisons, and now we can understand why this was chosen to be the Haftarah, especially because of this tradition that Korach looked in the future and he saw that Shmuel would come from him. So it's a natural connection. And one last thing here is that towards the end of the Haftarah, Shmuel says to them, fear not, even though you have done all of this and you've turned away, continue to serve God. And this is a message that Moshe also brings many times in trying to get the people to do tshuva. But he assures them that God will not turn away from them. And he's the one actually who, as it were, convinces God. Because after the sin of the golden calf and after the sin of the spies, God says to Moshe, I'll get rid of this people. I'll start a new people from you. And of course, Moshe will have nothing to do with that, and he defends the people. But he makes it clear to the people that you have to have what's called Yirat Hashem. And so here, Moshe is telling them that you have to have Yirat Hashem, and you have to do tshuva, and that's what Shmuel is doing here also. So here we see tremendous connections between the Haftarah and the Torah portion of the week. Okay. Okay, I have unmuted everyone. Opening the chats and recording again. Okay, so I do want to mention, for those of you who were here in the beginning, my wife mentioned that it starting tonight here in Israel, we're about 45 minutes from night, is her mother's yurtzeit, 18th yurtzeit, Fegel Bat Nachman David and Chava. So we are dedicating the learning tonight for an Aliyah to Neshama for her. And I want to mention now, I ended the class a little bit early tonight because I'm hoping to get to Ma'ariv tonight to be able to say Kaddish. And so we have a good 40 minutes of discussion, but my wife is going to make sure that there actually is a minyan. Things are very difficult here because of all the sirens, and not everyone can make it easily back to a siren if they're in shul. So it's not sure that we'll have a minyan. But if we have a minyan, I'm going to have to cut the discussion like right there and run down to the minyan. Okay, so having said that, we'll start with the chats. So Lewis points out, I mentioned when we played the song for people who hear it was the 100th Psalm. So Lewis says, 100 is your theme today. I listened to your Torah numerical gems that all of you should have received in your WhatsApp on the number 10, which becomes 100 in the lesson. So the numerical gems that you got today was about the process or the connection between 1, 10, 100, and 1,000. And so Lewis is just pointing that I happened to pick the 100th Psalm to play that song. Bracha says, also I want to mention, I'm sorry, I didn't mention it before. Right now, and I would actually be listening right now, is Rav Ginsburg. This is exactly 1 year from when he had his kidney transplant. And so he's doing a hitva'adut, and he is making a suda. It's called a sudat hodaya, a feast of thanksgiving. That was another reason why I chose to play Mizmor LaToda, a psalm of thanksgiving. And also for the miracles and wonders that we are seeing in the last week. It's like 10 days now. We are seeing momentous historic events. And like I cautioned everyone, though, in our exuberance for the events that are playing themselves out before our very eyes, the danger is not past. I know very well that this morning there were sirens, and we were in our bomb shelter, and we're very attuned to the booms. Sometimes they're very close, very close. And last week, I even quoted from a Dylan song where it said, in The Times They Are Changing, one of his most famous songs, one of the ends of one of the stanzas is, the battle outside is raging. It will soon rattle your windows and shake your halls, for the times they are changing. And quite literally, our house was shaking.
Mm.
But today, this morning, the booms went just on and on and on. They weren't close. So we knew something was happening. This is after America had taken out the nuclear installations. And sure enough, thank God, no one was killed. Many people were injured, but 10 different places were hit. Saw the pictures, whole apartment buildings were collapsed. It's just a miracle that no one was killed. And in 10 different places, there was tremendous destruction. So we need to be very, very thankful, and at the same time, very cautious and keep our prayers going, because the story is not over yet, but such incredibly good things are happening, but we have to make sure that they play themselves out to the end. So Bracha says to Rachel, thanks for sharing about the spirit of your mother. May she be a good advocate for all of us with her great ways of bringing people together peacefully. Yes, she was a very, very gentle neshama, a very refined, gentle neshama. And Rachel, my wife, puts in loving memory of my mother, Fagel, Bat Nachman, David, and Eva, Chava. Wendy wishes my wife a long life. I read that they burnt Shaul's body. Is this not against our beliefs, i.e. cremation? One second, I have to look here. In ancient days, there were different burial practices than we have now. So at the end of Shmuel Aleph, so it says, that they used to bury bones, not necessarily the whole bodies. I hear your question. I didn't look that up in the Mamlo Ez, so you'll forgive me that I didn't have a chance, but it is known that they would bury in one place and then rebury, which we don't do that much anymore. It's not. It's very rare. It's permitted, but it's rare to move a body to a different place once they've been buried. But in the ancient days, they did that all the time. They would temporarily bury someone for a year and then only take the bones and bury them permanently. Actually, we see with Yosef, that was before the Torah was given. This is after, that they embalmed Yosef, and which we don't do today either. So I don't have a full answer for you, but it's a very, very good question, because you're right. Here it says that they burnt the bodies of Shaul and his sons, and they buried the bones in Yavesh. So it's a very good question, and I just didn't have a chance to look it up. So Amy says the book of Shmuel was originally one book. The Christians chose to divide the book into two parts. Do you have any insights into why the break was made? How do you feel about the Gentiles inserting themselves into our text? Okay, so that's really an excellent question. It is true. In our tradition, the book of Shmuel is really considered one book. Also, because when the printing presses were first set up, and it was almost always Christian printing presses, So the truth is, the entire chapter and verse that we have is not originally from Jewish tradition. And it's just something that stuck. There are many, many people in Israel that would like to change that. But what's important is that when we count the 24 books of the Tanakh, we don't do, the 24 are according to Jewish tradition, where we're not dividing between Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. Or, for example, the minor prophets they're like separate books. But in Jewish tradition, all the minor prophets are considered one book. And so here, we'll call it, there is a problem here, because where they break between Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet, as far as I'm concerned, isn't necessarily logical. You could say it's logical because Shaul dies at the end of Shmuel Aleph, but the first chapter, Shmuel Bet, is the continuation of the story of how he died and everything. So you could say it's a logical breaking point, or you could say it's not a logical breaking point. And you have this in Torah portions also, where the way the chapters and the verses are very illogical. They're not logical. And the true Jewish way is that the way that the Torah is written, they're written in open and closed. We use the word paragraphs. And if they're closed, then it's a continual flow. And then there's paragraphs. That's the more natural flow than the chapter and verse that was inserted. And it was, we use it, but I'll just add this also. There are some people who don't try not to use the Gregorian calendar, meaning January, February, March, April. No, it's Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, etc. So it's the same thing. It's become almost natural to use the Gregorian calendar, but there are many people who are kind of pushing back and trying to reinstate that we should use the Hebrew calendar. So that was an excellent question, Amy. I did my best to answer it.
I have my Apple Watch shows both the English, we can call it Gregorian English, date and the Hebrew date.
Excellent.
On my watch, so I get to follow both. But I have to say, it's been a long time pet peeve of mine, because it seems like the Christians, when they divided up chapter and verse, sometimes they did it almost to cut off the head, or to diminish or demean the Hebrew the Parsha division.
Maybe, I'm not so sure about that. Remember, they don't have an oral tradition. So sometimes when they made the divisions, maybe they thought it was logical, but many times it isn't. I'm not sure of their motivations, but like I said, for better or for worse, most people use the breakdown of chapter and verse. And like I said, for Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet, you could go either way. You could say it is logical, or you could say it would have been more logical to include the first chapter of Shmuel Bet in the first book of Shmuel. I could see it going either way.
Did we protest? Did we try to get them to align the chapter and verse more with the Parshas at any point?
I'm not aware of like this big movement to do that.
As I understand, they created the chapter and verse to as part of the response dispute, the disputes they were having between the Jews and the Christians, so that they could, both be in the same place when they're talking about.
It could be.
Fighting.
I have to admit, I'm not like an expert on this subject. I'm really not, so I'm not going to pretend that I am. You might know more than I do about this because you might have done research. So, but the fact remains that for right now, most people, including most rabbis, will quote chapter and verse according to the way we have it.
Yeah.
But like I said, there are people who are kind of pushing back and trying to, and especially about the dates. I know that Rav Ginsburg, for example, it's always the Hebrew date. He'll rarely mention an English date. In fact, just last night I was watching one of his videos on YouTube where I was the MC. And so I'm sitting next to him at the end of the whole lecture. And part of my job was to announce when the next class is and how to get on the WhatsApp, whatever. So I mentioned that the next class is, let's say, Sunday, June 13th. And he turned to me like immediately and said, and the Hebrew date, like just immediately, right? And I knew the Hebrew date and I did mention it, but I first mentioned the English date because that most people, that's what they would recognize.
Right.
Anyways, it was interesting. It was just last night that I saw myself being corrected by Rav Ginsburg to make sure that I said the Hebrew date.
Well, of course, the time was all set from Britain because the sun never set on the British Empire. And so the time was set for the trains so that you could always know when to get on the train. But
yes.
It's interesting that
Greenwich
meantime, it is right outside of London.
Started with the trains.
Yeah.
And ships and trains. Everyone had to be on the same page, or it would have been like very chaotic.
Well, when you rule the world, you get to set the time.
Yeah, right. Okay, so Amy has a couple more here. I'll go through them quickly. Steinsholz translates boshet as shame. I almost said that. Ish boshet, you could say a man of shame. But I didn't want to do that because I think it would have been misunderstood. Like, okay, what did he do wrong? What did Ish boshet do wrong that he's named Ish boshet? Because we don't learn anything that he did anything wrong. We do see that he was somewhat of a weak person. And in fact, we don't even hear of Ish-Boshet until Shaul dies and Yehonatan dies. We never even hear of Ish-Boshet. And so you're correct though. Boshet means shame.
They said it because
but shame, I didn't want to get into a whole thing. In Hebrew, this type of boshet is considered a very positive thing. It's considered a very deep level of humbleness. In fact, the first word of the Torah, Bereshit, is a permutation of yirah boshet, the fear of shame. But it's a positive shame. And that's why I didn't want to say shame, because I would have to have explained that. Because then it's why is he named Ish Boshet, a man of shame? And so I didn't want to go there. But you're correct. That is one of the translations.
Can you answer the question above it?
Oh, I didn't see that. Oh, why do you suppose Hashem's name is not mentioned in David's lamentation over Shaul's death?
Shmuel is
good question. I don't know. Not sure.
He doesn't mention Shmuel either. He doesn't mention Saul.
Wait, hold on. Hold on. Yes, it does. Shaul is mentioned a number of times.
Oh, okay.
A number of times. Shaul and
Okay.
Yonatan.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, but why Hashem's name is not mentioned, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have an answer for that.
Okay.
Here, it's just coming from his heart. He's not like bringing God into the picture here. Obviously, God is in the picture, but it's not like it's a plea to God, or why did this happen, or God, please comfort. Here, it's just coming from his heart, how he feels, and is really a message to all of Israel how they should take the deaths of Shaul. It's really quite beautiful, and as I emphasized, it really became the template of all subsequent keynote of Lamentations. It's really very, very, very beautiful. Okay. Amy says in Bamidbar 16:15, Moshe says, I have not taken a donkey of any of them. Right, this is what I pointed out. This is exactly what I pointed out, that's one of the connections between the Haftorah and the Parsha. That Moshe says, I haven't even taken a donkey from them. And that's exactly what Shmuel says. So
I think I wrote that before you mentioned it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, Wendy says, interesting, danger of prophecy. See with Potiphar's wife, then with Korach's and others to justify their actions. You get the timing, yet got the timing wrong. So that's very good, Wendy, because here, this is what's called, yes, the danger of unclear prophecy. Remember last week in the Haftarah, we discussed at length that the wife of Potiphar had an unclear prophecy that she was meant to be with Yosef. And we learned from the Arizal that she, like all of us, had a Yetzer Tov and a Yetzer Hara, a good inclination and a evil inclination. And her good inclination, she had this premonition, this unclear prophecy. She was meant to be with Yosef. And so her attraction was very spiritual. On the other hand, she had a Yetzer Hara, and Yosef is very beautiful, and she was driven by pure desire. So Wendy's just pointing out that you have to be careful of unclear prophecy, because you can get the timing wrong. Okay, that is really it. That's it. So that's it for the chats. Like I said, I might only have 10 or 15 more minutes, but not that much after that. Anyways, I'm on call to go to Myra if there's going to be a minyan.
May I
Okay.
ask,
Yes.
may I ask a question about last week's Torah portion?
Yes.
Okay. In chapter 13, verse 25, note I'm using the chapter verse. It says, they returned from spying out of the land at the end of 40 days. And Rashi's commentary on this, but is it not true that the land of Israel is 400 parsangs by 400 parsangs? I don't know what a parsang is. And the distance an average person walks is 10 parsangs a day. There you have a 40 days walk from the east to the west alone. Yet they walk both its length and width. How could they have walked such a long distance in such a short time? But it was revealed before, known to the Holy One, that he would decree exile upon them of a year in the wilderness for each day the spies were on their mission. Therefore, he shortened the road before them miraculously. And this is a folding, an example of the folding of time and space.
Who are you reading from?
Rashi.
Rashi, and what verse again?
It's chapter 13, verse 25.
Give me a second here.
But it's sort of one of my pet things that I'm so interested in the times when the Torah gives us the folding of time and space.
Yes. Hello. Yeah, this is a great Rashi. Yeah. Because we discussed this idea that Eretz Yisrael, according to the sages, was 400 parsing by 400 parsing. And we discussed the whole significance of 400. But it's very good that you're pointing out from Rashi that it's connected to 40. 40 times 10 is 400. So there's a connection right there. Okay, so you read the Rashi very good. That yes. I also in my book on dreams, I write extensively about a Rashi about the folding up of space.
Wow.
Do
Okay.
you have the book on dreams?
I don't think so.
No?
No. Maybe one day you can cover it.
No, write me an email asking me and I'll send you that section.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah. Speaking of emails, I'm going to be in London or in Hampstead over the high holidays, and I wrote to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's synagogue to ask for the ability to attend, realizing that I needed to fill out forms and all that. So I also wrote to the synagogue in Hampstead, which is where my grandmother was born and my great-grandfather is buried. And I had to supply references, so I gave you as a reference.
Oh, okay.
So in case they ever contact you, you'll know.
Oh, okay. You should have Hatzlacha. Okay, anyone else? Anyone else want to say anything? Okay, good enough. I in that case, I will try to make it for Mincha. And Brenda put in my link for dreams. Okay, I will take this opportunity and I'll go to Mincha.
Stay safe, please.
Yes, thank you so much. 1 second.
Was Modayin hit at all?
It has been. It has been, and other places near us. We so far, let's say B'li Ayin Hara. B'li Ayin Hara. But at this point, you have to take it very seriously because the kinds of missiles they're sending are very destructive. And unfortunately, some of them get through.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, be well. Let me stop here. Okay, thank you, everyone. We're on for Tuesday.